Hello friends, in the series which we are doing on the making of contemporary India, we in one of the earlier lectures we talked about women in politics. In this the continuing lecture on women in politics, we will talk about the kind of issues which were discussed earlier in the earlier lecture, and giving some kind of a background about the kind of work which was done by the Indian women in the context of the women's movement, how they got engaged with the political sphere, and with the opening of the various organizations and various associations with which women they got associated themselves, and how women not only during the national movement but after the national movement when India attained independence, how they kept themselves well versed and aware about the kind of issues which were there in the society. And we find that in 1960s and 70s how women they also participated in various movements, whether the Naxalite movement, JP movement, Chipko movement, and anti-price rise movements. So various kinds of movements which were organized at different levels, and how women they also got associated with these movements. And we find that in 1970s how women they got associated with the anti-price rise movements, and even the housewives though they could not directly join the movement in the public rallies, but they got a lot of support from even the housewives. And we find that the movement later from Maharashtra it is spread to Gujarat, and how it merged into the Nav Nirman movement, which was launched by which was in a way influenced by J. Prakash Narayan's movement of the total revolution or Sampurna Kranti. And what we find that many a times the issues of women were not directly addressed in these movements, but when women they participated in these movements, then it had a lot of liberating effect, and women they also got a lot of self confidence when they in a way went and participated in all these kinds of activities and events. We also find that in Gujarat a very important new development was the founding of a women's wing of Textile Labour Association, an old Gandhian organization called SEWA or Self-Employed Women's Association, which eventually became independent of TLA. So we find that how women from the unorganized sector, those who were working as vendors and hawkers, and those who were even working in the home in the putting out system, how they organized themselves into some kind of a union, and which could provide them some kind of a collective bargaining in terms of providing the training, credit and the technical help, and how it spread to other areas as well. In the Shahada tribal area of Dhulia district in Maharashtra in 1972, we find a different kind of a movement which was concerned with the liquor, that how the issue of liquor is an important concern, and how it is also linked to the issue of wife beating as well, and the kind of money which has been which is being earned by the men folk, how that money is being spent on liquor, and because of which the entire family suffers. So women they became important contributors in such kind of movements where they broke the liquor pots in the drinking dens, and they in a way also punished the men publicly when they were not paying heed to their families. And this kind of a thing we also see in Uttarakhand as well, where under the influence of Gandhians such as Vinoba Bhave, Sarla Ben and Meera Ben, who had set up ashrams in Kumaon after the independence, and the local Gandhian leaders like Sundarlal Bahuguna, who became famous in the Chipko movement. And we find that women they came in large numbers in terms of picketing these shops, and these kinds of movements which were concerned with the anti-liquor, and how because of such kind of movements we find that the issue of prohibition became important in many of the states. We find that this prohibition policy in terms of liquor has also been imposed, and how Mahatma Gandhi he also realized this long back, and how women they were initiated into such kind of movements by Gandhiji himself. And another important movement was the Chipko movement in 1973, and how women they in a way hugged the trees so that the trees could not be cut by the timber contractors, how these trees were to be saved. So Chipko movement was to be considered as the first major movement in India for saving the environment, and it also provided some kind of an impetus to such kind of movements in the later times, when people they became more and more aware about the environment. And all of us know that unless we will take care of the environment, and environment is such a kind of an issue that at the international level several conferences they are being organized on the issue of environment, and the role of women is also very, very important in that context, that when you will find that when environment will deteriorate, then it will directly affect women, that in the areas where you do not find water, women they go miles to collect the water. They are also dependent on the fuel wood and the fodder, and how these women they also go to collect the fuel wood and the fodder. So Chipko movement in 1970s was an important movement, and how the contribution of the women in the Chipko movement was also exemplary. This is what one can see, and in the later times as well we also find that the environmental movements largely have been Gandhian in nature. And another important concern during 1970s was a report towards equality, and it was in the context of the status of women in India 1974-75, and it laid the foundation of women's movement in independent India, and highlighting the discriminatory socio-cultural practices, political and economic processes. And when we talk about the report, then it reopened the women's question for the government, academia and the women's organizations. Its authors they were Veena Majumdar and Lutika Sarkar, who later founded the Center for Women's Development Studies in Delhi. And when you tend to understand that what were the concerns of this report, we find that it was really an eye-opener in the context of the women's conditions, in talking about the development and the democracy from the gender perspective, and how the issues of the declining sex ratio, it led to the women sensitive policies in India and a lot of stress on the women's education. So such kind of reports, especially in 1970s towards equality, it highlighted the issues and the concerns of women, and it opened the field for the legislators that they frame such kind of laws or legislations so that the situation of women it can be improved. Then Monamai Basu, she has talked about the status of women's report, and she has argued that the committee it concluded that without the education, women belonging to Hindu community failed to utilize opportunities provided to them by the Hindu code. So it was not only in the context of the laws which were framed with regard to women in 1950s, which were connected to the Hindu code, but at the same time, if those legislations they were to be utilized in the proper manner, the kind of opportunities with these legislations they were providing, they were to be utilized, then women they were to be educated, they were to be made aware. And once they will be educated, when they will be aware of their rights, then they will definitely make efforts in that context. And we see that 1975 was the International Women's Year, and since then March 8 has been celebrated as the International Women's Day. So the issues which are concerned with the women, they are relevant at all the times, and such kind of days or years they in a way emphasize that we have to continue in such kind of efforts at all levels and at all times. Another important concern which we see was the Chhatra Yuva Sangharsh Vahini. There was an organization in 1979, and how it was influenced by the ideas of Jayaprakash Narayan, who was leading a struggle of agricultural laborers against the temple priests in Bodh Gaya in Bihar, and in which women activists and the ordinary women they were playing a major role, raised the demand that land should be registered in the names of women as well. So it was an important milestone in that sense, that when land would be registered in the names of women as women, then it would not be easily possible for the male members to gamble on that land, in that sense that they will not be able to sell it at their own will. And when women, they will have this kind of an opportunity where lands they will be registered in their names, they will get that kind of a patta or the deed in the name of the women, then definitely they will have that kind of a property. They will feel not only confident, but at the same time they will be empowered, because they will be holding some kind of a land which has a monetary value. So such kind of movements which were talking about the issue, not only issues of women, but also certain innovative steps which could be taken so that the women, they can be placed in a more comfortable position. We also find that Bhopal gas disaster was one of the greatest industrial disasters in India, and how because of this disaster so many people, they lost their lives. And when these people, they lost their lives, many of them, they also were handicapped in that way that they got maimed. And how justice was to be sought for the victims of the chemical gas leak, the gas leak of methyl isocyanate in the Union Carbide factory in Bhopal. And the Bhopal gas Pidit Mahila Udyog Sangathan, it played an important role so that the justice for the victims of the chemical gas leak could be sought. And we find that in 1980s, Samagra Mahila Aghadi, it emerged the women's wing of Shetkari Sangathan, which was spearheading farmers movement in Maharashtra from 1980. And over 1 lakh women, they attended its session in November 1986, and they took a stand against the brutalization of politics, which was affecting the women more than other sections of the society. And they also decided to put up all women panels for the panchayats and Jila Parishad elections. So we find that women, they were now they were becoming more aware, and they wanted to initiate such kind of steps where they can contribute a lot to the society. And another strand which we see is in the context of the autonomous women's groups. And we see that such kind of autonomous women's groups, they mushroomed in the urban centers from around mid 1970s, and many of these, they consisted of women who had been active in or influenced by the Maoist or the Naxalite movement. And in 1970s, we see that there was a decline of such groups, and there was a lot of debate and rethinking, in which there were a lot of prominent issues, the gender relations and the place of women in the political organizations as well. And we also see that in 1970s, because of the UN declaration of 1975 as the International Women's Year, there was a lot of activity across states. In different states, we find that a lot of activities which were associated with the women's movement, they were being organized, and the issue of women, they were being highlighted at different levels. And 1975 to 1977 is the period of emergency in India, and there we find that after the end of emergency, new or some sort of a spurt of the activity, it began. We find another round of activity during this time, and a women's group in Delhi began what turned out to be one of the most enduring institutions of women's movement, where Manushi, a general which has documented and analyzed women's movement, which was communicating its history, presented literature by women. So it was one of the most original, self-reflective and fearless voices in women's movement. So this kind of coming of a general called Manushi, and thereafter we find that other journals and magazines which were talking about the issues of women, they played an important role in terms of bringing the issues of women to the diverse media. And when women's issues, they will be in the media, when they will be known to the common masses, then they will be dealt in a very sensitive and serious manner. And we find that how women, those who were part of the Janata Party when it formed its government, those who were, many of them, they were socialist, they formed the Mahila Dakshata Samiti, and they played a major role in initiating the campaign against dowry, in which Delhi-based Stri Sangharsh was also very active. So women, they were also aware of the issue of dowry, that how it is one of the banes of the Indian society, and dowry harassment and dowry deaths, they were taken up from 1979 onwards in a big way through the rallies and the plays, demonstrations outside the houses of the dowry victims, and the demands for legal reforms. So we find that these kinds of measures which were taken up by these organizations to in a way highlight the issues was an important concern. And a bill to amend the Dowry Prohibition Act 1961 was sent to a joint select committee of the Parliament, and throughout 1981 and 82, women's organizations and the other activists, they presented evidence before committee as it toured the country. So we find that because of coming of such kind of issues in the public sphere, and when they were being discussed and debated, then government also became a lot more active, and now it wanted to in a way amend the Dowry Prohibition Act, which was implemented in 1961, and they in a way toured the country to seek the opinions of the women and the other activists, those who were associated with such kind of movements, and some kind of reforms they were in a way initiated because of the activists coming to the streets in the support of the dowry laws. That how dowry laws they were to be created, where anti-dowry activities were to be promoted by the people, and how dowry should not become some kind of a concern in the society, how it should not remain some sort of an acceptable form of a give and take, which was happening in the society, and it was causing a lot of stress to the people. So anti-dowry laws, they were being supported, and they were being framed at different levels at different points of time. Then we also find that the movement over a period of time declined, and there was a feeling that victories have not meant much, and it given the persistence of dowry and difficulty in securing the conviction of the offenders. Another issue which we find during this time was the issue of rape and the custodian rape, where the women, those who were in the police custody. So the custodial rape was an important concern at this point of time, and it was also in a way realized by the women's groups and the organizations and the other mainstream political parties, and they took up the issue in a big way. And finally we see a bill was introduced in 1980 to amend the existing law on rape, and when it was finally passed in 1983, the main change which was concerning was that the custodial rape was treated as a more heinous crime. It was a more ghastly crime than other forms of rape, and burden of proof was shifted from victim to accused, and this made a sea change in the possibility of bringing about conviction of the offenders. So we find that if there is a persistent movement with regard to certain issues, then the government was in a way forced to take such kind of steps where these kind of changes could be made, which would be in the favor of the victim. And we also find that when the government acted promptly, then many of the activists, they felt that their agenda had been hijacked, or it had been appropriated by the government. One other important concern or one of the cases which was there in 1980s was the Shah Bano case in 85-86, where we find that Supreme Court gave a judgment with regard to the maintenance which was to be given to Shah Bano, and how government brought about a legislation where this judgment was reversed. So it created some kind of a situation in the society where voices they were being raised that whatever was done by the government at that point of time was not in the favor of the progressive forces, and women they could have been given such kind of relief by not only by the Supreme Court but even by the government as well, and the laws they should be framed. And we also find that this kind of an issue which was there in 1980, it also got further complicated by the kind of atmosphere in which the issues of Muslim identity, they got entangled with simpler issue of women's rights. So we see that this case which was concerning the issue of the women's rights was made into some sort of a case which was concerning the Muslim identity, and in this atmosphere the government had to relent in some way, and when it reversed the judgment which was given in this case. And another case of the 1980s was concerning the Sati of Roop Kanwar, where she became a Sati, and it was concerning Devrala in Rajasthan. And there were people, those who were there, and they saw it that it was an attack on the Indian tradition. So there were people, those who were supporting the idea of Sati, and there were so many others, because through legislation also Sati was banned long back, and it was considered to be some sort of an evil, or some sort of a drawback or weakness in the context of the social problem. It was also seen as a social problem as well. So there were people, those who were opposing Sati, like Swami Agnivesh, who was an Arab Samajist, and he visited not only Rajasthan but Haryana, and he in a way talked about this issue and tried to communicate to the masses regarding this issue, that this is one of the things which should not be there in the Indian society, and how it is detrimental to the rights of women. And we also find that the autonomous women's groups in 1980s, there was a shift in the context that now they were not there in the context of the mass campaigns, and they were setting up the women's centers for the legal aid in terms of counseling and the documentation and research, publication, etc. Because they felt that the mass campaign, with their focus on the legal reform, they had not really succeeded in solving the problems. So they felt that such kind of things they should be done to provide relief to the women, that if they will provide the legal aid, counseling, when they will do documentation, so it will be more helpful for the women. There were other groups like Saheli in Delhi, and they felt that it was important not only to focus on the women's problems but also on their joys, and encouraged women to express themselves through music, dance and art. So such kind of women's groups which were functioning in different parts of India, they not only focused on the women's issues, but they wanted to communicate that how women, they have to live their life through joys, and how they were to be motivated, that how women, they find expression in the different art forms, be it the music or dance or any other art form. So such kind of things, they were also being done. And it was also being talked about that how women, they should not be objectified in media, how they were being portrayed in the advertisement and the films, and how women, they were not to be objectified in that sense. And there were a lot of campaigns with regard to the feticide or the rights of the girl child, for the water and for the housing of women in the slums. So we find that different organizations, one of them was Anveshi in Hyderabad, which set up a platform for the theoretical studies of women's issues. And in Delhi Center for the Women's Development Studies, it also promoted the research and the documentation, including the later years launching of a journal for the gender studies. And we also find that university-based centers, they were also initiated, and courses on feminism, courses concerning the issues of women, they were also initiated, how they were being incorporated in the curricula in a formal manner, so that people or the students, they come to know and they become more sensitive to the needs of women. And Bipin Chandra argues that the movement has suffered from a lack of unity about the goals, strategies and the methods, from sectarianism, which was probably contribution of the left, and a tendency for reacting to immediate crisis rather than building a consensus on an agenda for action. So this was seen as some sort of a shortcoming in that sense, and how it was also argued that some sections, they were swayed by the money which was received from the foreign organizations into taking up the issues that concerned the donors, and they did not have much relevance in the Indian context. And one of the other things was also the kind of gap which was there in the urban educated women's groups and the rural or poor women's. So there was some kind of a disparity in that also. And we find that the government also took some kind of measures with regard to the introduction of the Panchayati Raj Bill, and how the Panchayati Raj Bill, we find that 1/3 reservation was given in Panchayati Raj, and so this was an important concern, that women, they will become when they will also get 1/3 reservation in the schools, in the parliament as well. And we find that how education, health became important concerns. Women, they were to be educated, they were to be provided health facilities, and the problems with regard to the lack of infrastructure in the schools, teachers, absenteeism, free primary health facilities were to be provided to women at all levels. So we find that a lot of things, or a lot of efforts, they have been made by the government at different levels, and women, they are continuously playing an important role in their fight against any kind of discrimination which has been imposed on them. Thank you very much.